Madam Secretary, Friedman family, ladies and gentlemen, it is of course a surreal honor for me to be introducing Dr. Rice tonight in Chicago on the 100th centennial of Milton Friedman's birth. For a schmuck who sells discount toasters on the internet, it's really surreal. I can't help but slip in one national security story, given our guest, that concerns Milton Friedman, that I was reminded of by Alan Greenspan's video. He buried the lead, as the journalist would say. The thing that Milton Friedman was most proud of in his life, the single achievement, was his pivotal role, or his role in ending the draft, which others who were there, such as Alan Greenspan, say was pivotal, decisive. And it culminated in this famous exchange that was alluded to by Dr. Greenspan, where, I mean, it's a fabulous story. It was called the Gates Commission, and you should look it up if you get a chance. But it started off, everyone, including the chairman, was against, what most people on this commission were against ending the draft, going to an all-voluntary force. Over 15 months, Milton gradually nudged and persuaded them, and it ended in this crescendo with a hearing with General William Westmoreland. And what Dr. Greenspan didn't say was, at the end of a day of being maybe verbally tied into knots by Milton, which many of us in this room, I'm sure, have experienced, General Westmoreland said, I don't have any interest in leading an army of mercenaries, meaning an all-volunteer force. I don't have an interest in leading an army of mercenaries. And Milton said, well, how do you feel about leading an army of slaves? And General Westmoreland took some offense and said, well, I don't appreciate hearing my patriotic inductees referred to as slaves. Milton said, well, I don't like hearing my patriotic volunteers referred to as mercenaries. And he won the day, and that's... Anyone who had the chance to ever debate with Milton Friedman, it really was like being with an Aikido master who would just tie you to the knots. Milton, now that was the achievement of which he was most proud, but I'll remind you, at the end of his life, well, in 1955, he published a paper proposing school vouchers, free school choice, and in 1996, he decided to devote really what became the last 10 years of his life and his fame and so forth to one cause, which he thought was the most important cause facing the United States. School choice, he described it at one point as the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And he pointed out how so many politicians in our society like to hold themselves out as the champions of the poor and underprivileged, but on the one issue that could matter the most, they're on the wrong side. On another, less publicly, he often said that the greatest tragedy of our government school system, and he called it the government school system, he insisted it not be called the public school system for various philosophical reasons. The main tragedy was the under-achievement, the under-education of the supremely talented. Which brings me, of course, to Dr. Condoleezza Rice, the daughter of the Reverend John Wesley Rice and Angelina Rice. Her resume will give anyone an insecurity complex, so I'm not going to go through it, other than to say that she and her family just demonstrate the power, the transformative power of education. As Dr. Rice has described it. I actually crossed paths with Dr. Rice, who doesn't know this, but I was a graduate student at Stanford in philosophy, oddly enough, and in the mid-'80s, late 80s, and I saw one day a poster for a seminar open to the Stanford community on arms control. And I wandered into it, and I'm sure there were luminaries of various sorts, but I can't even recall their names, so beguiled was I by this Professor Rice. And I remember that day distinctly, and of course I wasn't the only one beguiled by Dr. Rice. George Shultz, Brent Scowcroft, George Herbert Walker Bush were similarly In trans, Dr. Rice left Stanford, joined the National Security Council as a Soviet expert, came back, was provost of Stanford. I have to check, but there's a chance my doctorate has your signature on it. If you were, and then returned, of course, to be George W. Bush's National Security Advisor, and then I would say our nation's most beloved Secretary of State, at least since George Marshall, and maybe ever. Through her transformative diplomacy, Dr. Rice challenged institutions of power and authority and oppression throughout the Middle East, which I actually think is bearing fruit today. Although in the spirit of intellectual honesty, I just have to mention, and Milton and Rose made this, they said this publicly, so I'll mention that they said that the only serious disagreement they had in their 75 years was over the Iraq War. And I remember sitting in a car with them, and they were telling me about 2004, 2005. Milton said, my position is we should never have gone in, but now that we're there, we should fight to win. And Rose's position was we should never have got in, and we should walk out tomorrow. Fortunately, they didn't walk out, and we didn't walk out. And it may be and Dr. Rice's transformative diplomacy has transformed, or at least has shaken, the institutions of power abroad. Since her return to private life, Dr. Rice has continued on that path by publicly taking positions on education reform that would have really been difficult to imagine most public figures taking a decade or more ago. There were some wonderful lectures at Harvard, the W.E.B. Du Bois lectures, where she discussed the transformative power of education, both as an individual commitment and a social commitment. And shockingly to me, on the Council on Foreign Relations, a report was issued earlier this year, U.S. Education Reform and National Security, making this education reform a national security issue. So without further ado, it is my profound honor to introduce the Honorable Madam Secretary, Professor Dr. Condoleezza Rice.